Hi, Misha here, and this is another one that I've been needing to do for, well, a good while. Today, or rather tonight, which is fitting considering this is a night fighter, I'm going to look at the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, one of the absolute largest American fighters, really the largest when it was first made. The first purpose-built night fighter designed for aerial radar. But also something that was in service for a very brief period of time. This is a 1/72 scale die-cast model from Air Force One, who do make some interesting lesser-known planes. I will give them credit for that. And this model is from August of 1945, so it's a later production P-61B. And for context, I have the Bristol Beaufort. Excuse me, not Beaufort. Beaufighter, although the Beaufort is worth mentioning. The Bristol Beaufighter, Mark 6F. And a de Havilland Mosquito. Now this is actually a B Mark IV. I really should have a F Mark IV for fighter. This is the reconnaissance bomber variant, but this is what I have. This model is from Corgi. This model is from Hobby Master. And all three are 1/72 scale die-cast. So if nothing else, it'll be interesting to look at the different makes, even if they're not of the exact same plane. Well, in the late 1930s, Britain had been working on radar. It found ground installations pivotal in the battle to defend against German bombers, especially at night. But it started working on aerial intercept radar that could be mounted on board a plane and that did not require communication with the ground source. This was known as AI, or AI radar for short. It was a very large and heavy device by modern standards, but by the time it was downright microscopic, considering other previous radar and how new the technology was. But it was bulky and heavy. Now the Beaufighter was something that Bristol worked on in 1938 as they saw that the RAF would have a need for a long-range heavy fighter. And they started with their Beaufort light bomber, really using much of the same wing and fuselage, but reconfiguring it more as a, well, long-range heavy fighter. The rear turret was turned into a navigator observer position. The front, of course, still had the regular pilot, so a crew of two. It was given a number of guns. Early on they had a few less, but very soon they would go to 4 20mm cannon, as well as 6 .303 machine guns. It also could carry a small bomb load. And later versions would also carry torpedoes, but this video is not on the Beaufighter. They discovered that this was about as small of an aircraft as possible that could carry the new AI radar sets. So, beginning in very late 1940, some Beaufighters were fitted in the nose with early versions of the aerial radar, and they started to be used in night fighter missions in October, and by November of 1940 they had some of their first kills. The rear observer's position would also now work with the radar. He would be the radar monitor operator in addition to being the navigator. And backtracking just a wee bit, in August of that year, 1940, Lieutenant General Emmons from the USA was briefed on the work in Britain, and then was given a request that the RAF, the Purchasing Commission, desperately needed a new high-altitude, very long-endurance night interceptor, night fighter. And so a deal was struck in September. The British would provide all the plans and whatnot, and America would agree to manufacture as part of the whole Lend-Lease. And by October of 1940, Mr. Jack Northrop heard about this, and knowing the requirements were very lofty, they needed to carry the heavy radar set, and needed at least 2 turrets according to the British, multiple guns. It needed to be able to fly, hopefully all night, but at least for 4 hours. Again, speed, altitude. He knew that a twin engine was going to be necessary, and that the bigger the better for fuel and to carry everything. We started working with his chief designer, and by November 5th, he made a proposal to the U.S. Army Air Corps to fulfill both an American need and British. By December 5th, after touring around with the design a bit, they submitted a kind of finalized proposal. And by December 17th, it was accepted, and by the beginning of 1941, 2 prototypes were ordered. And it was pretty much a shoe-in, what Northrop designed. Its only real competition was from the Douglas A-26A, which had not even flown yet either. But the A-26A was essentially a variant based on an attack plane or light bomber selected in 1939. So it was much like the Beaufighter, something pressed into a role. But the new aircraft, as it was designated XP-61, would be purpose-built to use a radar and to be a night fighter interceptor. But things did not go smoothly from the beginning. There were several delays with the power plant. They wanted to use the double Wasp engine. And then in April of 1941, there was a review committee on the design, and they wanted some changes. I'm not saying the changes were bad, but they did delay it even further. For example, Northrop's original design would have 4 20mm cannon in the wings. They wanted to move them to the nose. They changed the style of the turret on top several times. Originally, the British wanted 2 turrets, and Northrop tried to accommodate this, but in the end, he ended up settling on the 4 20mm forward-facing cannon, and then a dorsal turret housing 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns. And this dorsal turret would be powered, remotely operated. It would be able to rotate 360 degrees. It could rotate up and down, transverse. It would be manned from inside the gondola, as the center section was known. Pretty advanced critter. It could also be locked in the forward position to give a full 8-gun salute facing forward by the pilot. They also wanted to start integrating hard points on the wings for drop tanks to increase the range or loiter time. And also maybe even use them for rockets or iron bombs. This all required redesign, and so on and so forth. Then in 1942 they ran into some trouble with the propellers, not to mention a few bits of trying to source parts for the engines because of other priorities in the war. And so the P-61 did not fly until May 26th of that year. And it would be followed by pre-production models known as the YP-61. And it's around this time that the moniker Black Widow would be given for quite obvious reasons. So after a couple of years of development during wartime and resources, did what Northrop come up with really meet the demands for the UK and the USA? Well, sort of. Well, the P-61 Black Widow was certainly a unique design. Northrop did try a few more conventional styles, but just didn't feel like it would deliver what was necessary. It does hearken a bit to the P-38 Lightning, which itself was designed as a long-range interceptor for use primarily in the Pacific. But the P-38 was designed mostly to intercept fighters, and also, more importantly, to be daytime. This was, of course, nighttime or all-weather, and targeting more bombers, hence the heavier armament. And it is a heavy critter. It is nearly 50 feet long. It has a wingspan of 66 feet. So it's into bomber territory for sure. But it was definitely not a bomber. It had the 4 20mm cannon and the 4 .50 caliber machine guns, as I mentioned. And that was its initial armament. It had a crew of 3, and their seating and situation are quite unique. This center section, the gondola, the front nose, the extended nose, is designed specifically for the AI. Behind it, you had the pilot. Behind him, in a slightly raised deck, you have the gunner. And those two were kind of in the same compartment, and how they got in it was quite interesting. They actually entered through the front landing gear wheel well. Yeah. And in the back we have the third crew member, the radar operator, who could also man the turret if needed. He had his own little hatch because his compartment was separated from the other two. In the middle, we had all the equipment aside from the radar itself. We had communications gear, the radio, but most importantly we had all the stuff for the turret, which was a pretty advanced piece of hardware for its day. As I said, it had an early computer, analog computer, and of course all of its ammunition. So yeah, this was these two compartments are totally separated. It used 2 double wasp engines, and it had a pretty, well, I wouldn't say traditional, but it had a tricycle landing gear. Of course, the split tail and all that good stuff. Quite a unique design. So how did it do on the performance front? Well, the Beaufort, I keep calling it that, I apologize, the Beaufighter, because it was based on the Beaufort, was certainly kind of put into the role. It was very good for Britain as a night fighter in 1940 into 1941, but by 1942, when the Black Widow first flew, it was getting very dated. It was about 41.5 feet long. It had a wingspan of about 58 feet. As I said, it had 10 guns facing forward. Some later versions would also mount another gun in the observer's position, although typically not in the night fighter role. And it could carry a modest bomb load or external fuel tanks for more range. Its top speed was about 330 miles per hour, depending on the exact variant, and its max altitude was 20,000 feet, or maybe just a little less. It did better than the preceding Blenheim, but again, by 1942, German fighters like the FW-190 were kind of owning it. The P-61, on the other hand, had a top speed of around 365 miles per hour, so about 10% faster, and it had a much more impressive max altitude of a little over 33,000 feet. And while early versions did not have the hard points, later they would give 2 and even 4, and it had a modest iron bomb or even rocket capability. And its radar had a range of about 5 miles when conditions were right. So it sounds like it's, not bad, except this guy came along in the interim. The Mosquito was something that de Havilland believed in, but many in the UK did not. And it turned out to be one of their best aircraft of World War II, made of primarily wood. It was easy to produce, and the idea was to have an unarmed bomber, just a fast bomber, going fast and high. That was given priority, so the B Mark IV, but also a fighter variant was designed, the F Mark II, and it would mount 4 20mm cannon and 4 303 machine guns. This is longer than the Beaufighter. It's about 44.5 feet long, but it has a smaller and narrower wingspan of about 54 feet. So overall lighter aircraft, although in the bomber role it could carry about 4,000 pounds, not bad. But where it really excelled was its speed. Depending on the version, of course, it could do 400 miles per hour or even a little faster. Also, it had a very good maximum altitude, all things considered, of about 37,000 feet. And like the Beaufighter, it had a crew of 2, although 3 could fit in it if needed. Pretty much you had your pilot and your bombardier/navigator, who could also work as a radar officer when in the night fighter role. So after enough bomber Mosquitoes and reconnaissance Mosquitoes were around, the night fighter variant was first adopted and first put into production in January of 1942, and mid to late year it started to really replace the Beaufighter. And throughout 1943, both would be used as night fighters. But really, by the end of that year, getting into 1944, this would become the RAF's nighttime interceptor. And of course, as Germany was more on the defensive war, and the Allies more on the offensive, These would be used as also nighttime intruders, dropping so-called cookie bombs. This proved to be a very versatile plane. And was a little smaller and lighter, and had really no vices that the Black Widow itself did not have. So kind of by the time this was ready for production in 1943, the British did not need it. At least not really. Also in 1943, the British loaned the U.S. Army Air Forces about 100 Beaufighters for use as convoy escorts and night fighters, mostly to be used in the Mediterranean, but pretty much anywhere. So America would start flying these as well because it did not have an adequate night fighter. The P-70, which was basically the Douglas, wasn't doing well at all. So the Beaufighter helped fill the gap till the P-61 was in production and squadrons could be trained and then sent to the front. But even though things weren't looking particularly great for this aircraft, it did end up serving not only in Europe but also the Pacific and in Eastern Asia over like China and Burma, India. And while its combat record was relatively brief and the British weren't really interested in it, America did its best with it. So let's get into that a bit. So by May of 1943, a baker's dozen of pre-production models were ready. They were undergoing testing and began training. And one was sent to the British for evaluation, but by this point they were very happy with their Mosquitoes. They felt that the P-61 was just too slow. I would also think they just thought it was a little too heavy and big. Didn't really suit their needs. And again, America was also flying some Beaufighters. So it took a little time. Finally, by the end of that year, enough were ready to train a squadron, and then the first ones were shipped over in February to Europe. They appeared in the UK, and they were assembled, tested, tried out, and were getting readied for their first missions. Some of the people that flew these, the crews, were existing night fighter pilots. Others were brand new, wartime. It's worth pointing out that the P-61As sent over to Europe that spring and early summer often lacked the upper turret. They just relied on their 20mm cannon. So quite often the gunner was removed because he was redundant. Sometimes the radar operator would stay in his little back cabin, but oftentimes he would bump up to the front to be in the same place as the pilot, get another set of eyes. The two positions there were pretty much interchangeable. Both could help with the radar and aiming. So, yeah. It's interesting in May of 1944, because many in the U.S. as well as the U.K., of course, felt this was too slow. They arranged a fly-off between it and the de Havilland Mosquito. And according to the U.S., well, okay, the Mosquito is faster, but they claim that the Black Widow exhibited better climbing and better turning, although even they admitted that it was pretty minor. They would have a rematch in July, and this time America would declare that the P-61 was faster and had better climbing and turning than the Mosquito. But really this second showdown was a little bit hinky because the P-61 they used was stripped down and the engines were fine-tuned and perfected, and it was really built for speed. It wasn't a standard production model. So yeah, I think it was just to build confidence in the aircraft for their crews and whatnot. Anyway, they started to fly missions at the beginning of July, and on July 15th, a P-61A attempted its first intercept of a V-1 flying bomb. When it dove to intercept the very fast-moving pulse jet bomb, it actually experienced this dome or cone in the back. It crushed under the turbulence and pressure, and the aircraft was okay, the pilot at least was, but the intercept was ordered off and the plane returned home. But the next day, on a repaired plane, the same pilot was again ordered to intercept, and this time on July 16th, the first kill in Europe happened with a V-1 flying bomb. And this, the tail kind of crushing, imploding in flight, was just a problem with early P-61As, and it had quite a bit to do with the fact that the turret was not there. So the center kind of mounting, the weight distribution was off. So it would get better as turrets would start to appear on late European planes. As August would draw on, these would encounter more and more German aircraft and have their first, downing of manned planes and bombers and transports. The P-61 would try to get an Me-163 Comet in October, and the Comet just completely outran it. And then a short time later, they would try to go after Me-262 Messerschmitt. And again, it just totally outran it. There wasn't even an engagement. So it could not keep up with the newest, the fastest German planes, as was kind of feared because of its speed. But it was able to get other German planes, for example, the Junkers Ju-52 transport. It could get older Bf-109s. It could get the Germans' own night fighter, the Bf or Me-110. And it could go after the Junkers 87 Stuka. Slower moving, larger targets. So when it encountered German aircraft, it was often outclassed. But in the Pacific, it had kind of the opposite problem. This was more suited to the Pacific, the longer ranges. And the first of these were sent over in early June. They started flying patrols middle of that month. And then by June 30th, the first aerial victory by a Black Widow was achieved when it shot down a G4M Mitsubishi Betty bomber, as it was known. And from that point on, they would continue to fly patrols, very long patrols using the extended range. Now most, if not all, of the ones sent to the Pacific, because they were later than the Europeans, would have the turret. They would also start to appear late P-61As, and pretty much all P-61Bs would have the underwing hardpoints for iron bombs, but in this case, more importantly, fuel tanks, as you see on this one. Early they would have 2 tanks. Later Bs would have 4, giving them even better range. And they would fly long patrols, but most patrols were kind of a wild goose chase. They just never intercepted Japanese planes of any kind. Because by 1944, the Japanese Air Forces was already getting pretty decimated, and as time would go on, they would retreat more and more to the home islands. But since Japan had not kept up with their fighter technology like Germany had, when the P-61 would encounter them, they would have superiority, and often pilots would get multiple kills. So it was a rare occurrence, but when it happened, it was decidedly in this plane's favor. Zooming back to Europe, in December, these were used to defend ground troops, escort, give close air support to them during the German attempted breakout known as the Battle of the Bulge. And at this time, they would start using these as daylight, ground attackers. Their heavy armament, forward-facing, was a great asset. And by this point, versions able to carry iron bombs were starting to come available. So you started to see some daytime use in Europe. And then getting into 1945, these would continue to escort both day and night the advancement on Germany. And they actually would go up against the last few Stuka attempts to attack the Allied advancing armies, acquiring more Ju-87 downs, with the last aerial victories in Europe really in March of 1945. And that was pretty much the end of it for them. In the Pacific, they would continue to fly patrols, but they would just, by 1945, not encounter many enemy aircraft. One fun fact, in January 30th, as it happens, of 1945, a P-61 was used as a distraction. There was a prison camp, POW camp, on the Philippines, and the Army Rangers were trying to rescue over 500 prisoners. And one of these flew overhead and kind of made a clown out of itself in the sky for a few minutes, doing low passes and flipping and diving and banking, basically just to distract the guards. Never really fired a shot, but it gave the Army Rangers a better chance at the element of surprise, and they were able to rescue their fellows. So that's kind of neat. And then this aircraft here, known as Lady in the Dark, the model, is famous because on the night of August 14th, leading into the 15th, it's kind of unofficially known as having the last aerial victory of World War II before the surrender of Japan. And it was a very pacifist way of doing it. This aircraft basically forced a Japanese plane to take evasive action too close to the sea, and it crashed into the sea. So it didn't fire a shot at all. It definitely showed its positive side more in the Pacific, just as the P-38 did. In Europe, it was okay. It was not a bad plane, but it wasn't amazing. You know, kind of a average student, as it were. It did its job and definitely laid some interesting groundwork, but it had some quirks too that were never really overcome. For example, they tried a version with turbocharged engines known as the P-61C to try to give it a little more oomph. But, well, they made about 40 of them. It encountered quite a few problems, and the war was over before they could really be overcome. So yeah, they would build about 40 of the C, and they would build about 200 of the original A, and the bulk of the other 700 and so built were of the B variant here. So not a huge production run, but considering they only made them for about 2 years, and all were made by Northrop in California. Well, after World War II, this had a very brief twilight career. In 1945, the Allies were already seeking jet-powered all-weather interceptors to replace their propeller-driven aircraft, but there were several obstacles to getting an AI radar set on board a jet. So these were kept in service as interceptors in Europe for about a year until 1946. In the Pacific, they were stationed there briefly as well. Then they were recalled to the USA, where they were stationed along the coast, also up in Alaska and around the Panama Canal. At this point, hostilities, or at least I should say tensions with the Soviet Union were on the rise. So in 1947, more were restationed and kept around. They really weren't wanted, but it's the best thing that they had. But the problem was production had ended 2 years earlier. These planes had seen combat. Even though not many were actually shot down at all, a number were lost to accidents, other types of attrition. It happens. Numbers are running low, spare parts are running even lower. They were even having to cannibalize some planes to keep others flying. So in 1948, for one thing, this was renamed to from the P-61 to the F-61 under the new independent Air Force. And at the same time, the Air Force had a fly-off to select a new interceptor. And Northrop would win again with its XF-89, but the F-89 would not be ready for a number of years. So this would be kept around until 1949, and then most would be scrapped or sold off. A few would be kept around for research and testing, but by the early 50s, they were pretty much all gone. And by the late 50s, there really weren't any flying examples left in the world. A few have been restored over the years, but it's just really a footnote. And it was primarily just flown by America. But to be fair, the Beaufighter had much the same fate, even though it was a couple of years older. The Mosquito actually had a little bit longer history, but its wooden construction, which was great for wartime, would eventually catch up with it. You can't really refurbish wood like you can steel. So the last of these were out of service by the 50s and out of complete training service by the 60s. But these planes were all built for pretty short service lives. They weren't built for longevity because it was wartime. So if a rivet failed or a weld failed in a year or two after several thousands of flight hours, who cares? It was mass production for wartime. But I decided, if nothing else, it's a very interesting story. I think most stories involving Northrop are interesting. As for the model itself, it's your typical Air Force One. Has a very nice all-metal stand that actually screws together. Another thing it's a little annoying about their stands, they do sit very high. But oh well. It does have gear up or down. As usual, I have mine in the up position. The propellers not only spin, but actually they are made of metal, which is pretty neat. You don't see too much of that. And it has the fuel tanks, but they are not removable. And it has crew figures, I believe, But again, they're not removable. Although in this particular aircraft, where they get in and out, I don't know how they would be anyway. But it's pretty much all metal. The only parts that are polymer are the fuel tanks. This center support back here is polymer, but these are metal. The turret is plastic. The only slightly thing, the turret doesn't move. Kind of hoped it would, but I guess they decided they just couldn't make it strong enough and still move. And since these could be locked in the forward position, I guess I'll let it pass. Minor gripe. It is neat though. It's a very heavy duty model, pretty sturdy. Comes with a nice stand. Yeah, very heavy. Hobbymaster. I think by now you know the drill. Gear up or down. Pretty metal construction. Kind of a weaker stand. I think the stands are about the weakest part of Hobbymasters, frankly. And the propellers spin, but they are plastic, which again, the most all are. It does have crew figures, and they are removable. You can open the canopy front and back. For some reason, my back little bubble doesn't like to stay on well. If it's just sitting on the shelf, it's fine, but it's not very secure on this one. I've seen other Beaufighters from them that it's fine. It's just how this one is. It has the cannon in the front. Nice model. And of course, the Corgi Mosquito is quite impressive. Like most Corgis, it's mostly metal. I like that even the tubes are metal. Propellers are polymer. Gear up or down. Crew figures inside, but like the Air Force One, you cannot remove them. I don't know if any Corgis you can. Even the Corgis you can display with the canopy open, the figure is fixed in there. I mean, I guess you could pry them out, but yeah. So not many have removable figures. That's pretty well a Hobbymaster thing. But I thought I would just kind of give the history of a somewhat obscure but still cool World War II night fighter. I have other videos on these, so don't worry. I just brought them out for comparison mostly. If you have any questions or comments, please do post them below. And if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.